Peter Dutton, the opposition leader's interview with me. Peter Dutton, thanks for your time.
Pleasure, Andrew. Thank you.
So this week you're doing 60 Minutes. You've spoken to my colleague Peter Clennell. You're trying to soften your image?
Must be an election coming up. You're all working flat out and the interview requests keep piling up. So, look, I think there's an understandable interest, intrigue in both the Prime Minister and I, and it's an opportunity for us to talk about what we believe is the direction our country should take, and it's an important decision people have to make, so it's good that people are properly informed.
The Trump tariffs, let's talk about that. Anthony Albanese got an assurance that it's under consideration, this exemption. Do you think that will occur, given what the President said, that it's under great consideration? And would you be better in negotiations with the US President, in your view? Well,
I certainly hope that the tariffs removed quickly, because it's not in our country's best interest, and frankly it's not in the best interest of the relationship. We have an incredible relationship, long-standing, with the United States. We have the AUKUS arrangement that we've arrived at in the last couple of years. The trading opportunities are there for us to expand in years to come, but it does damage the relationship if the tariff stays in place. And I'm surprised that the Prime Minister didn't have a full court press knowing that this was coming. Not just Ambassador Rudd, but every minister should have been cycling through Washington. I'm not aware that other ministers have been to Washington since Penny Wong was there for the inauguration. If they have, that's great. But the Prime Minister probably should have been on a plane to the US, as we've seen with other world leaders, and there should have been greater engagement with the President earlier on.
Richard Marles was there on the weekend, right?
Well, and he went with an $800 million cheque, or whatever the figure was, and it doesn't seem to have made any difference at all. And with respect, Richard Marles is a nice guy, but he's batting fairly significantly down the list in terms of the government's key hitters. And I don't know whether Don Farrell and others who obviously have got more gravitas within the government have been engaging with their counterparts on the phone. But this, to put it into perspective, I mean, it's hard enough for manufacturing in this country now with the energy costs, the cost of insurance, all of the input costs have gone up. In fact, we've had a threefold increase in the number of manufacturing businesses that have gone insolvent over the last 2.5 years. So it's tough enough already to build things and make things in this country. The government should have been doing everything they could to stop this from coming in the first place.
Richard Marles is the Deputy Prime Minister. Why are you saying he's batting down the order?
Well, I just don't think, again, I'm friends with Richard and I like Richard, but I just don't think he has the gravitas that the Prime Minister would have if he had attended, or if other senior ministers, including Penny Wong and including Don Farrell, would have had they engaged with their counterparts. And as
Don Farrell says his hasn't been confirmed, so he can't engage.
Well, he should be engaging. He should be engaging with state. He should be talking with his key advisors that his department would know. But as you know, the way the US system works is it's not just the secretary, but there are key advisors within the Trump administration that Don Farrell should be having a very close talk with. In fact, he should have an established relationship with them by now.
This is kind of a yes or no question. If you're elected, will you replace Kevin Rudd as ambassador?
It's not a yes or no answer that can be given. We have to have an ambassador who is in our country's best interests. Kevin obviously is an accomplished person as Prime Minister of our country, and if he's the best person for the job, then he should stay in the job. If it turns out that he's had no access to the White House and no real influence in relation to this issue or whatever the next issue might be, then you would have to reassess his position. But at the moment, we're being told that he's effective in his advocacy in the administration. I suppose time will tell.
So you'd make a judgment call once you hit office, once you got more information.
Yes, but having said that, my instinct would be to leave him in the job. But if there are insurmountable problems that he has, or that the administration has with him, then that would make it very difficult.
What do you think of Donald Trump's start? Because you've always railed against China encroaching upon Taiwan. He's talking about Canada as the 51st state, Donald Trump, Greenland, Panama, now Gaza. Does any of this, do you sort of take a step back and going, oh, this sounds a bit concerning?
I just think we've got to look at his presidency in a different light. Donald Trump is different to any of his predecessors, certainly in the modern age. And if you look at his background, he's a businessman. He does deals. He brings parties together. He swaps contracts. That's been his background, and it's not a background probably that's been shared by too many of his predecessors. And so I don't think you're taking everything he says literally. The statement, the executive order, said that there would be no exemptions in relation to the tariff, and then an hour later in the press conference, the President's talking about, well, maybe there is room to move. I think we need to cut him a bit of slack. I think he's, frankly, in terms of his standing in the American population's mind, which is very high at the moment in terms of his favourability, he's delivering on what he committed to, and that is putting America first, and that's his job. The job of the Australian Prime Minister is to put our country first, and unapologetically so. He's doing that, and he's getting rewarded in the polls and in the public's mind. It's a different dynamic. He's not a Reagan, he's not a Clinton, he's not an Obama, he's not a Bush. He's a very different character, and if the government approaches it as they would have with his predecessors, with Biden, for example, I think they will get the relationship wrong very quickly. Is
there any policies that he's implemented you'd like to see implemented here?
Look, my great influence in my political life has been John Howard. I was very fortunate to work with John in the period of 2001 to 2006. 2007, I've worked very closely with him since then, and that's the model that I look like. I don't emulate the decision that's been made on tariffs. I believe in a free market, and I don't think it's in America's long-term interest for tariffs. But obviously, that's a decision for the administration. But from our perspective as a trading nation, we've got to get produce out the door, and we produce more than we can consume. And our building industry, our agricultural industry, our mining industry, it all thrives and survives on that export market and those international relationships.
What about his contention there are only two genders? Are you with that?
Well, I've been clear in relation to there being two sexes, and a group of people obviously outside of male and female, a small group, but nonetheless important to recognise, who are intersex or indeterminate. And if you're talking about genders, well, people have a different association, there's a different recognition that people have, and that is an issue for them. I'm not, again, I'm in the Howard mould of not being interested in what's happening in people's bedrooms, or not knowing. I've got no interest in people's relationships. I want to be a Prime Minister for our country, and I want to make sure that we've got policies that work. I think the interesting piece, to your earlier question as well, about what has happened in America, I think there is a real live debate in our country about what happens in women's sport. I think girls and women should be protected, and I do think that a young girl who wants to compete in the 2032 Olympics but can't place at the moment because she's got biological males competing against her, I think that's a real problem, and I think there is a debate in our country in that regard.
So you're not changing the passport, for example?
We're not changing. I've been clear about that. It's our policies aren't going to change, and there are priorities, cost of living, and other issues which I think are foremost in people's minds.
Well, given the US has pulled out of the Paris Agreement, why is the coalition sticking with a net zero target? There must be elements of your base thinking you should just junk it.
Well, look, in terms of climate, I think there are three important objectives for us. One is that we need to decarbonise. We need to have reliable power. In Townsville at the moment, where it's been raining for the last 10 days, and unfortunately more rain is predicted, under Chris Bowen's model, under the Anthony Albanese renewables only policy, Townsville would be in darkness now, as well as water lapping through yards and into homes and businesses. It wouldn't work under their model unless diesel generators could be turned on, because there has been limited sunshine and the power can't go on an intermittent basis. We need baseload power. We also need to have an eye on price. There's no consideration of what families or businesses are paying for electricity. It's 3 times the cost of other comparable regions in the world. And why are we harming families? I think the Labor Party, I think the biggest damage that Anthony Albanese has inflicted over the course of the last 2.5 years has been through the energy policy. I think he has driven up prices. He's created an unstable market. We're now talking about importing gas
into Victoria in a country like ours. Well, was he supposed to build a coal-fired power station? I mean, how do you? What's the quick fix to this during a transition? The quick fix is not to have uncertainty, investment uncertainty, and to give the market the signal that the only thing the government's interested in is green hydrogen and other emerging technologies. It's pie in the sky stuff, and the Albanese government has been about trying to please and placate Green voters in inner city Sydney and Melbourne. And he's forgotten about people in the suburbs and in the regions, and the energy policy is a classic example of that in play. All right, I'm going to run through a few cost of living questions now. What's the coalition plan to reduce the price of groceries? Well, Andrew, one of the biggest impacts on groceries is the energy policy. So it's not just your power bill that's gone up at home, it's the IGA store, it's the cold storage operator, it's the supermarket with their freezers. And the trouble is that all of that additional cost is being passed on to consumers. So one of the best things that we can do to get grocery prices down is to make sure that we've got productivity in the economy and to make sure that we have a downward pressure on energy prices. Because under the government's proposal with their 2035 targets, prices for electricity and gas are going to go up much higher, and therefore grocery prices will stay higher for longer. So even if interest rates come down by 0.25%, and let's hope they come down soon, it's not going to have the impact on those businesses and on grocery prices. It's all of these decisions that the government's made or haven't made over the last 2.5 years that have contributed to grocery prices going up. Well, you sort of talk about getting more gas in the system to reduce prices before you get on the nuclear thing. How do you do that? Well, we need to make sure that there's an investment proposition. So at the moment, as you know, the government's talking about a nature-positive anti-mining bill that they've withdrawn because of the WA election at the moment. But that essentially cruels mining in Western Australia. 12 months ago, Chris Bowen would not mention the word gas. And now reality is struck. All of a sudden they're saying, well, maybe we need some gas in the system. So a government that is open to and supportive of investment in gas, of further discoveries, of bringing projects on more quickly. They funded the Environmental Defenders Office to stop gas projects from taking place. And now we're seeing the reality hit and gas having to be imported into Victoria, which is an outrage. What's the coalition plan to reduce the cost of insurance? Well, again, there are a number of factors. I think the mitigation issues play in. There are stamp duty and GST issues at a state level which add to premium cost. There are obviously reinsurance issues, some of which are outside of our country's control, but we need competition, we need depth in the insurance pool, and we need to make sure that we're not being ripped off by insurance companies. And as we've done with the supermarkets, where we have threatened divestment if consumers are being ripped off, similarly in the insurance market, we will intervene to make sure that consumers get a fair go. Because at the moment, people are paying too much for their insurance, and what's resulting is that people aren't taking out insurance. So that moral hazard is created for a number of reasons, and people just simply can't afford to insure their car or their home at the moment. What's the coalition plan to reduce the cost of housing, especially rent? Well, firstly, we need more supply. The federal government, both Liberal and Labor, have been good at fuelling demand, so providing support, and necessarily so, to first home buyers. But because we don't have responsibility for planning, it's done at a state and local level, we haven't had an influence on the supply side. So firstly, we've got a $5 billion fund which helps councils get over the balance sheet constraints that they've got, so help them pay for some of the infrastructure that is required around sewerage, around water, around roads and connectivity to get the next stage built of that land development. So bring on more supply. The government's brought in a couple of million people over the course, of the last year. When you look at the numbers, quite staggering. The number of people they've brought through the migration program, that has completely and utterly driven the demand for housing at a time when we've had an 11-year low on housing starts. And so no wonder there's a housing crisis, and therefore a rental crisis as well. This wasn't a problem 5 years ago. The government has created this problem. They're not building many houses at all. And when you speak to developers, they're just saying, look, the cost of construction means that we can't proceed with that project. So there's a supply side, there's a demand side that we have to provide support to, and we've said that in relation to
accessing superannuation to get young people into housing more quickly, and that's incredibly important.
If the government extended its subsidy on power bills, would you support that?
If it's going to be inflationary and it's going to keep interest rates higher for longer, and it's going to keep grocery prices higher for longer, and it's going to keep electricity prices higher for longer, then no.
The suggestion is it doesn't. It actually lowers inflation.
Well,
you don't accept that?
It has a spike in the quarter where it has where the payment's being made. So there's a slight dip, and then it comes back, and that's the problem. Is that that's what the government's seeing at the moment.
So someone has to end it sometime. So it may as well be.
There's just nothing free in this world, and the government needs to stop pretending that things are for free. You can provide support to people who have a HECS debt, and you can wipe that debt, but don't pretend that somebody else, another taxpayer, isn't paying for it. So I just think we need to have a debate about, firstly, the government's not going to deliver their promise of $275 reduction on power prices. People's power bills are up by $1,000. The Prime Minister, don't forget, promised that power prices would be dropping by $275 per year. That hasn't happened. Power prices have gone up. It's
absolutely true it hasn't happened, but where do you get the $1,000 from?
Well, that is the figure that's available to us, and people's power prices have gone up by $1,000. 34% electricity bills have gone up. Now, you can have a one-off hit where you can say, here's $300, but people aren't stupid. People know that that's not going to survive for the next quarter or next year. We have to have an energy policy which helps us decarbonise, helps keep the lights on, and helps reduce power prices.
Are you going to promise Australians tax cuts in the campaign?
We've been very clear that we want a simpler, fairer tax system. We want to reduce taxes wherever possible, but we'll be dictated to by how much money is left in the bank. We're not going to act in an irresponsible way. The Liberal Party, the coalition, will always manage the economy more effectively than Labor, and we do that by spending in a reasonable, responsible, pragmatic way, and if we can afford tax cuts, then they'll be delivered.
Because originally you did indicate you wanted to reinstate closer to the Stage 3, the original Stage 3 package in an ideal world in terms of the budget. Would you want to do that?
Well, it's an important point to make, because before Stage 3 there was Stage 1 and 2, and they were delivered by a coalition government. Stage 3 was legislated to be implemented, and the government rejected that. So I want tax cuts across the board because I want to try and provide incentive, and I fundamentally believe that people at the moment are working a second and third job, not because they enjoy the extra hours away from their family, but because they can't afford to pay their school fees or their health insurance or their grocery bill. People are hurting, and I want an environment where they can afford to live again, and Anthony Albanese is promising an environment where the cost of living pressures are going to continue.
Could you pay for them with public service cuts or freezes or something of that nature that you've sort of alluded to?
Well, the government, the Albanese government is following the Allen government and following the Miles and Palaszczuk governments in relation to increasing dramatically the numbers of public servants. That's what's happening here because it pleases the Public Service Union, not because it's good for service delivery. So we've said that we want to protect and preserve the frontline positions, but the back office positions, which always balloon under a Labor Party here in Canberra, we should be looking to reduce those. And the government...
Could that be used for tax cuts?
Well, it could be used for paying off debt. It can be used to reduce inflationary pressure in the economy. There are different uses for it, and we would weigh all of that up, and we'll be very honest about where we see those priorities.
You and the Prime Minister have both spoken about the prospect of achieving a majority government win. But it's far more likely, isn't it, that you could win something like 70 or 71 seats and have to rely on confidence and supply from the independents. Would you be up for that?
Well, I've said clearly before, and again, leaders can say before elections that they won't talk to those on the crossbench. The reality is that there is no serious commentator, I'm not aware of one, in the country at the moment who says that Labor can form a majority government. I think it's at $15 on Sportsbet. So it's just not happening. And when the Prime Minister says that he can form a majority government, people know that he's not telling the truth. When people say that he won't do a deal with the Greens, people know he's not telling the truth. Because the Greens will never do a deal with us. We will never do a deal with the Greens, particularly given now that we know they're a racist, anti-Semitic party, and yet the Prime Minister will jump into bed with Adam Bandt and do a political deal, no question about that. And the Green Teals will only ever support a Labor government. So I think we need to be honest about the fact that if you vote for Monique Ryan, if you vote for Zoe Daniel, if you vote for Kate Chaney, you're voting for Anthony Albanese and a minority government with the Greens. It would be a disaster for
But
WA.
if you won 71?
We'll talk with the crossbench, but I can promise you that it's clear from their voting pattern. Kate Chaney, Zoe Daniel, Monique Ryan, 80% of the time they support the Greens.
So they're never coming your way?
They will never come our way. And let's be honest, if they're
nevertheless, there might be 4 or so who might come your way if you got to 72.
Well, it would be unusual that if we were able to achieve 72 and we were a number of seats ahead of the Labor Party, that there wouldn't be a guarantee of supply and confidence from the crossbench. But some of them will only ever support the Labor Party, and I think if they're into transparency and honesty, they should be transparent and honest with the public before the election about, if you vote for Kate Chaney, are you going to get Anthony Albanese, or will she support a coalition government in a minority situation?
You spent a lot of the last few years attacking the Chinese government. Now you're saying your government would have a better relationship with China than this one in an economic sense. It's got to be about votes in seats dominated by Chinese Australians.
No, I think it's about openness, and I've spoken to the ambassador about this, about more trading opportunities with us. I think, as John Howard would point out, China has a different leadership today than it did during his period as Prime Ministership. So we have to deal with the scenario before us, and I do believe in free trade. I was part of a government that negotiated the free trade agreement with China, but we need to be honest, as the Prime Minister has been, at least in private, talking about this being a very precarious period, and we need to make sure that we can work with China, have mutual respect, build a trading relationship, and also celebrate an amazing Chinese diaspora community in our country.
So what would you say to Chinese Australians who are thinking twice about voting for you?
Well, I'd say to them that we are the better party for their family, for their community, and for their country. And if people in small business in Chinese communities want certainty, if they want to educate their kids in a school where kids aren't being indoctrinated on every woke policy that is the want of the Labor Party, then vote for the local Liberal or National Party member. If you want a thriving economy where you can afford, or your kids can afford to buy a house, vote for the coalition. There is nothing in common with the Chinese community here, which is an aspirational community, and the Labor Party. The Labor Party offers nothing to the Chinese community or the Indian community or other communities. They're aspirational communities. They want to get ahead. They want to build their wealth. They want to educate their kids, and the coalition is the party for them.
And these statements you made about the significant investor visa and bringing it back, can you take us through that?
Yeah, look, again, I don't understand the controversy here, because if you're talking about high net wealth individual who can come to Australia, who can invest, who can donate to local philanthropic causes, who can employ Australians, then why wouldn't we consider that? The Labor Party has a policy of bringing in people without security checks. I would never propose that for people, regardless of what visa category they're on. If people are a national security threat, if that's what the Labor Party is suggesting, they don't come through any visa under a government I lead.
But aren't you promising a 2-year moratorium on foreigners buying houses in Australia? Isn't that one of the investments you can make under the significant investor visa?
Well again, and this is exactly the point that I made, that there are some design features that you can resolve in opposition, and there are others that you require legal and departmental advice that you would require in government. But I've been clear, people on whatever visa category need to go through security checks. And in relation to our housing policy, yes, I want to see Australians first into housing, and that includes first-generation Australian citizens who want houses for themselves and their kids.
You said you had a net migration target of 160,000, then you said maybe it's not that. What is it?
Well, at the moment it's 185,000 for the permanent program.
Yeah, what about net migration?
We propose to reduce that for the first year, ramp it back up by year 4 to 160,000. We say that that'll create 40,000 homes for Australian citizens, which goes to your point about trying to find a rental property as well as buying one. and over 5 years, so it increases the housing stock, in addition to the 500,000 homes that we think can be created with our $5 billion
but applications are onshore for permanent
plan.
migration a lot of the time. What about net migration? You talked about the 2 million coming into the country.
But Andrew, look, you've got such a distorted market at the moment because you've got students who are staying past their visa period because they've applied for humanitarian visas. Now, under this government, they're a soft touch. Under our government, people can abide by the conditions of their visa. If the visa has an end date, the expectation is that they leave our country at the time of their end date. And in many cases, they either have to apply offshore or they're not eligible for the next round application. And at the moment, just to put this into perspective, you've got students who are getting to the end of their visa period, are applying for humanitarian visas with no merit whatsoever, but they're here for 7 years because with work rights, because that's how long it takes for the matters to be resolved through the courts. So the government, you talk about it in terms of sugar on the table, which was the way the Indonesians put it. The Australian government at the moment has a sugar bag on the table and is providing incentive for people to stay, not to leave, which is part of the housing crisis that they've created.
Would you bring Michael Pezzullo back?
Well, I worked very closely with Michael Pezzullo and I have a great deal of respect for him. I think he was vilified unfairly by the government, and I would make a decision in relation to appointments if we're fortunate enough to win government.
The appointment of Jacinta Price to government efficiency. What's behind this, and will she be on the Expenditure Review Committee?
Well, I think there's a good case for her to be on the Expenditure Review Committee. I haven't made a final decision in relation to who will be on that. Normally the composition would be the finance portfolios and somebody from one of the biggest spending portfolios, normally health or education. But Jacinta would be central to the budget process, so it would make sense for her to be part of the ERC.
Why her for that job?
Because I think she's got a real practical understanding of what's happening in the real world, and you need somebody who has that ability to communicate, to connect with people, to understand the rights and the wrongs that are happening in the marketplace, in the business sector. And I think Jacinta has a broader set of skills than people understand. And as she demonstrated during the course of The Voice, she has a great ability to communicate and to connect with Australians and to understand what's happening in their lives.
But she wouldn't have a department like in America?
My proposal is that, and our position would be, that would be contained within the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, because it allows you a whole of government perspective of expenditure and policy and programming commitments that you would need to make.
What's your personal view of Anthony Albanese?
Anthony and I have spoken publicly about this, both of us, that we have an easy relationship. We can talk about issues. He's generously invited me into his office on a number of occasions where we've been able to talk about issues that are important to the country, national security issues, and issues that require bipartisan support, including changes around the NDIS and aged care. I was very definite when we came into opposition that we would be an opposition akin to John Howard's opposition to the Hawke-Keating government, and I did that because there's a period for opposition, there's also a period for supporting policy which is in our country's best interests, and we've done that. And we've also driven much of the policy agenda over the course of the last couple of years from opposition, and that's been an important feature of our time, as well as the unity that we've had within our ranks.
Is there more cutting to be done to the NDIS?
If there's corruption, if there's waste, then it's going to detract from the ability to help those who are most in need, that is the profoundly disabled. And I've been a strong supporter of the NDIS for that reason, particularly for ageing parents who have got disabled children and are worried about what will happen to their adult children when they pass. And that peace of mind is something that's really important and something that can be provided through the NDIS. So if there's corruption and there's misappropriation and the money's not being spent effectively, then the scheme will topple and those who are most in need will miss out. And I'm not going to tolerate that. But we don't have any plans for cutting the NDIS. The government's given us assurances that the money's being spent appropriately, but in the next breath they then say that there are a number of criminal investigations underway. So if you receive advice in government, and obviously we don't receive that security advice from the police in opposition, and they say that there's a particular loophole being exploited and tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars are being ripped out of Australian taxpayers' pockets, then you would expect us to respond to, to that policy failure.
Just finally, if you do become Prime Minister, you see Donald Trump come into office immediately, do a whole bunch of things. Tony Abbott probably did Operation Sovereign Borders pretty immediately. Is there any one or two things that stand in mind that you want to get cracking on immediately if you become Prime Minister?
Cost of living immediately. We've got to provide support to families. Families are going under at the moment. People are barely keeping their head above water, and there are a lot of small businesses. 27,000 of them have gone broke over the last 2.5 years under this government's watch, and we've got to get our economy back on track. We need to make sure that we can secure our borders, and we need to make sure that we can keep people safe in their own homes and in communities. And there will be a number of priorities that are reflected, given the commitments that we'll make to the public otherwise between now and election day, and we'll live up to the promises that we've made to the Australian public, and I take that responsibility very seriously. I've served under 4 Prime Ministers and I've watched 3 on the other side. I intend to govern for our country in a way that will help people, not hurt them. And we've got a big mess, as John Howard did after Keating's period, that will need to be cleaned up. And the economy and helping on the family, helping families with their budgets, helping the housing crisis to resolution, all of that will be priorities for our government.
And are you expecting a budget before the election?
I don't think there'll be a budget before the election. I think the election's imminent, and I think the Prime Minister realises that people have stopped listening, and that they realise that that this government is going from bad to worse, and they can make all sorts of promises, they can run all sorts of scare campaigns over the course of the next couple of months or weeks, whatever it might be. I think Australians are too smart for that. They realise that this government started with promise, and they've finished in a pretty in a state of disrepair, would be a polite way to put it. I think this government is running on 3 flat tyres at the moment, and if they're re-elected in a minority with the Greens, then the pain that Australians have felt over the course of the last 3 years will be nothing compared to what's over the next 3 years and beyond that. So I think if there is a second term of the Albanese government, there will be baked in decisions that will take a generation to undo, and I just don't think families can afford 3 more years of Anthony Albanese.
Peter Dutton, thanks so much for your time.
Pleasure. Thanks, Andrew. Thank you.